One, two, three, four.
Hello, you're listening to the SKYLIT Books podcast series. We are a general interest independent bookstore located in the Los Feliz neighborhood of Los Angeles, California. This year, because of the coronavirus pandemic, we've had to close our store and cancel in-person events. But SKYLIT is your neighborhood bookstore, and we are finding ways to create community even while we're far apart. In the coming weeks, we'll be putting out lots of new audio content to help you discover new books, connect with authors, and check in with your favorite booksellers. To learn more about how you can help keep SKYLIT alive, please visit our website at skylitbooks.com or check out our social media accounts on Twitter and Instagram. You can subscribe to the podcast on Podbean, iTunes, and Spotify. Thank you for listening and enjoy.
Welcome, everybody, to the SKYLIT podcast. My name is Agnes. I work at SKYLIT Books in Los Angeles. We are a neighborhood bookstore. We've been around at this point just over 24 years. We just had our anniversary. And I'm very excited about this conversation today. We've got a really incredible gathering of people to hear a little bit from the book, The Accident of Color, A Story of Race and Reconstruction by Daniel Brook, and then to talk a little bit. The Accident of Color is a technicolor history of the first civil rights movement and its collapse into Black and white. Brutal slavery existed all over the New World, but only America followed emancipation with a twisted system of segregation. The Accident of Color asks why. So today we have with us Daniel himself. Daniel Brook is a journalist and author whose writing has appeared in Harper's, the New York Times Magazine, The Nation, Slate, and the Pacific Standard. His previous book, A History of Future Cities, was longlisted for the Lionel Gelber Prize and selected as one of the 10 best books of the year by the Washington Post. Brook's research and writing have been supported by fellowships from institutions including the Library of Congress and Tulane University's New Orleans Center for the Gulf South. Born in Brooklyn to parents with roots in both North and South, he was raised on Long Island, educated at Yale, and lives in New Orleans today. Also joining us today is Roger Guenveur Smith. Mr. Smith adapted his Obie Award-winning solo performance of A Huey P. Newton Story into a Peabody Award-winning telefilm. His Bessie Award-winning Rodney King is currently streaming on Netflix. Also among his work for the international stage are studies of Frederick Douglass and Christopher Columbus, Bob Marley and Jimi Hendrix, iconoclast artists Jean-Michel Basquiat, Simon Rodia and Charles White, and baseball greats Juan Marichal and John Roseborough. With Mark Broyard, he created and continues to perform Inside the Creole Mafia, a not too dark comedy. And we also recognize him from countless films and television shows. He studied at Yale University and Occidental College, and has taught at both institutions, as well as Cal Arts, where he directs his Performing History workshop. He's a first-generation Californian with roots in both New Orleans and Charleston, South Carolina. And the delight only continues. I'm very excited to say we also have with us today Erin Aubry Kaplan. Erin Aubry Kaplan is a Los Angeles journalist and columnist who has written about African-American political, economic, and cultural issues since 1992. She is a contributing writer to the New York Times opinion pages and also the Los Angeles Times, where from 2005 to 2007, she was a weekly op-ed columnist, the first Black weekly op-ed columnist in the paper's history. For 9 years, she was staff writer and columnist for the LA Weekly and a regular contributor for many publications, including KCET.com, Salon.com, Essence, and Miss Magazine, where she is currently serving as the book review editor. Erin's essays have been widely anthologized, and she won the PEN USA 2001 Award for Journalism. Her books include Black Talk, Blue Thoughts, and Walking the Color Line, Dispatches from a Black Journalista, and I Heart Obama. She holds an MFA from University of California, Los Angeles, and has taught creative writing in the MFA and undergraduate programs at Antioch University, Los Angeles. She was born and raised in Los Angeles, though her family is originally from New Orleans. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Roger to hear a passage from the book.
Well, on March 12, 1864, a pair of Southern gentlemen, E. Arnold Burtneau and Jean-Baptiste Routenez, arrived at the White House to lobby President Abraham Lincoln. They hailed from New Orleans, city that had been retaken by the Union just 1 year into the Civil War. and had become a testing ground for what the multiracial nation might look like when the war was won. The visitors were leaders of the city's distinct, openly mixed race Afro-French community, and they presented the president with a petition signed by 1,000 of their fellow property-owning free men of color, demanding the right to vote. At the time, this was an audacious ask. Though the petitioners addressed the president as citizens of the United States, technically this was no longer true. 7 years before their visit to the White House, the nation's highest court had revoked their citizenship. In the Dred Scott case, a dispute ostensibly over slaves' rights, the Supreme Court of the United States had declared that an African American, whether enslaved or free, had, quote, no rights which the white man was bound to respect and is not a citizen within the meaning of the Constitution of the United States, end quote. According to the Supreme Court, the petitioners had no rights that Lincoln was bound to respect, but they were hardly his inferiors. Now, Lincoln, you see, he had been born in a log cabin in Kentucky, and though whip smart, he had completed just a single year of formal schooling. By contrast, Roudenez was a trained engineer. Burdeneau, for his part, made his living as a wine merchant, that most refined of professions. In aristocratic fashion, this son of a French father and an Afro-Cuban mother went by his middle name. Lincoln was so lowborn that he didn't even have one. While the wine merchant kept tabs on the Paris auction house prices of the latest Loire Valley vintages, the rail splitter turned commander-in-chief's entire international experience amounted to visiting the Ontario side of Niagara Falls once. In fact, it was Lincoln's youthful trips down the Mississippi River to New Orleans, especially his month-long sojourn there in 1831, that constituted the deepest cosmopolitan immersion of his life. For Lincoln, the meeting with Burdeneau and Roudenez might well have felt like a visit from foreign dignitaries, if not interplanetary ambassadors. But the strangest thing of all about these visitors was their racial identity. Though these men were light enough to pass for white, Roudenez was just 1/8 African. Burdeneau, with his rakish wave of dark hair, looked like a stereotypical Frenchman. They clearly had no interest in doing so. Burdeneau and Roudenez were of partial African descent, and they were completely unabashed about it, willing to go to the White House as community representatives of African Americans in their state. They did not feel that their African heritage made them any less American than their French heritage did. Lincoln, in contrast, with his dark features and anomalous height, had spent his entire political career dodging scurrilous rumors that he secretly had African ancestors. Touch of the tar brush.
Well, I've made many decisions in my professional life, but asking Roger to read that passage is probably the best one I've ever made. Thank you so much.
I agree.
Thank you for sharing it, Daniel. Thank you. Wonderful passage and a great introduction to a great piece of work. Thank you for sharing it with us, and so lovely to be in the middle of such distinguished writers, Erin and Daniel. My pleasure, and thank you, SKYLIT, for hosting us.
I concur. Oh, is that me? Sorry, I was so riveted by Roger's performance. That was wonderful.
I think we're all a little.
Yeah, I read that passage, but I did not hear it like that, and that was wonderful. So, thank you, Roger. Thank you, Dan, for getting in touch and for writing this book. It is marvelous, and it's so interested in the issue of color in a really kind of existential way, and it's just fascinating and really makes me see myself differently. So thank you for that. Thank you to SKYLIT for hosting this, and for putting this out there. And I really hope Americans of all skin shades, read this book, because it says so much about everybody. So thank you. And I'm so excited to be here and to talk about this book.
Thank you, Erin. Yeah, the passage Roger read is from the very beginning of the book. And the book ends with a brief passage I'd like to read, sort of brings it all around. It says, after losing the Plessy versus Ferguson case at the Supreme Court, the Comité des Citoyens, which brought the case from New Orleans, issued the statement, quote, notwithstanding this decision, we still believe that we were right. What they believed they were right about was not merely that separate could never be equal, but that in America, separate was not even possible. As New World people, we were too mixed up to sort back out. Say what we may, Americans would never be black or white. We are mestizos, Creoles, misfits all. And that is ultimately the argument of the book, that it takes this story about two communities, one in New Orleans, one in Charleston, that are bravely, openly of mixed race, and makes the argument that as unique as these two communities seem, what's unique about them is only their openness about their background, not their actual background. And that this background is pretty much universal to Americans, and our inability to openly admit that and face that is at the root of so many of our social problems.
Right. I was thinking as Roger was reading, and I laughed when he ended with, touch of the tar brush. I've heard that before. It brings home the idea that, color Africanness was a source of shame and degradation. Secrecy, you had to keep it secret. And so the openness of the mestizos, the brown people, the Afro Creoles, the openness was what confused, was kind of radical in in Reconstruction and after the Civil War. You could be black, but not. You had to be black, but visibly black. And if you had black, but you could pass, you were supposed to pass. You were not supposed to claim blackness. And these people claimed it because they'd always claimed it. And it's just really really tragic and poignant that their way of life, the way they saw themselves, was just completely rejected and recast as unacceptable as Black. And unfortunately, at that point, Black became the side you did not want to be on ever. It became the back of the streetcar. It became the bottom of the caste system, and it's still to this day still there. So it's just really tragic that we missed our moment. America missed its moment, but not for want of trying on the part of these folks. And
yeah, and the book traces these remarkable civil rights moments of progress during Reconstruction, including desegregating the New Orleans public schools, desegregating the streetcar system in Charleston, and again, the openly mixed race community that is providing a disproportionate number of the leaders of this movement is turning it around and saying, to all of the ostensibly white, ostensible elites, you're no different than us. We're just open about our background and y'all are covering it up.
Right.
And again, they have this kind of ace up their sleeve where they say, well, if you are going to segregate the streetcars, we're going to come out with our knowledge of who's actually, 1/8, 1/16, 1/64 African descent. And that we've lost sight of that, that when you come back to the civil rights movement of the 1960s, the racial binary is so deeply entrenched that's lost. So sometimes I think of like an almost bizarro kind of like Afrofuturist Brown versus Board of Education, where the claim on the part of the anti-segregation forces is that the school in Topeka, Kansas, that's ostensibly all quote unquote colored, is to a boy or girl filled with students of European descent, which undoubtedly it was. Undoubtedly it was.
Right. Well, race has made idiots of everybody, but all those people who were calling out really the concept of race and a color line, they would also say, oh, by the way, you're my father, you're my, we're related, we're actually related. And it's so interesting to learn in your book that Justice John Harlan, who I knew was a dissenter, the lone dissenter in that culminating case, Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896, had a black brother, right? Or he had a brother or half brother.
Yeah.
And yeah. And he gave him pause. And he said, "This is family. We are." It influenced his perspective, as it should have. But for a lot of other Americans or white Americans with similar relationships, what's so tragic is that they just saw those relations. They didn't see it as a relationship. They simply saw the blackness came first, and the blackness was degradation, and that had to go on the other side. And so it was still very much in the legacy of slavery, just putting your property over there and not considering it human, part of yourself.
Yeah, Roger, do you mind telling that little vignette about when you're in Charleston and you're going to your ancestors' cemeteries and how that goes down?
Well, I'm connected to Charleston through this beautiful woman here, who is my late mother, Erin Guenveur Smith. And my mom grew up in Charleston. Many generations of Charlestonians named Guenveur, who are now buried in Charleston in two separate graveyards. One at St. Mary's on downtown, and all of those gravestones are in French. And then further uptown in the Friendly Union Cemetery, all of those gravestones are in English, but they are the same people, divided by the color line, even in death. So when I visit my ancestors in Charleston, I have to make two separate cemetery moves. My mom, obviously a very fair-skinned woman who was discriminated against just as the blackest black person was in Charleston. In fact, our family home was right across the street from the College of Charleston, and our family was not, of course, admitted to study there, and of course was not even welcome on the campus, which was just across the street from our family home. My mom went to study in New Orleans at Xavier University, and it is there that she became reconnected with the community with which we were connected in the 1700s, the community that fled the Haitian Revolution and came to mainland America. Many of those people came, of course, but some people came to Charleston as well. And then when my mom came out to California post-war, having completed her education, She became united, of course, with the great migration of people who came from New Orleans, like Erin's family, during the great gumbo famine of 1958.
Yeah.
And you would go into, the church hall at Holy Name or Transfiguration. It would sound like the Seventh Ward. It would smell like the Seventh Ward. And Erin has written very beautifully about this generation of people, which of course included her late father, Larry Aubry, who was a fantastic community activist and extraordinary writer as well. She gets it honest.
Oh, thank you, Roger. Well, yeah, I forgot about the Great Gumbo Famine, otherwise known as the Dust Bowl. No,
Yeah.
Anyway, yeah. Well, were you born in Charleston, Roger? You born here?
I
Right?
was born in California, first
Okay,
generation.
yeah, first generation. Me too. And thank you for mentioning the Seventh Ward. I grew up hearing all about the Seventh Ward. The Seventh Ward basically transplanted itself to Los Angeles. But it took me a long time to understand the Seventh Ward was where all the Creoles lived in the Seventh Ward. So even though we had this binary of black and white in New Orleans, they still maintained that, I guess you call it kind of their own life, their own sort of bubble, not legally, but culturally. And so I grew up with a lot of stories about that bubble. They were poor. They didn't have a lot of advantages, but they had the sense about themselves that they were different. And I always thought that meant elitist, like, they saw themselves as different from other African Americans, and they were. I mean, historically, there was a difference, but my father and many other people in the family were staunch activists because they understood that history of Creole people or mixed race people agitating for everybody else. But they still, they came to LA because the South was the South and the binary was the binary. My mother, who was very fair, like your mother, would sort of rebel by going into white establishments, passing as white. My uncles did the same thing. My grandfather refused to ride the streetcar at all. But even when you were passing, because the binary forced you to pass, you were always in fear of being found out. If somebody outed you and told the world you were Black, there were big consequences to pay. So there was a particular kind of terror for these mixed race people who no longer had a place in America, but they had a culture, they had a togetherness, they had a sense of history, but they didn't know. There's nowhere to put it. There was nowhere to really live it. So they said, screw it. So they came to LA where, you can just kind of, in theory, be who you are and not be bothered with anybody. That didn't exactly happen.
No, not exactly.
But it was, it promised some kind of reinvention. But it always struck me as interesting, this great migration out of the South to other cities. It was American people looking for America, looking for a place that would accept them, as as part of that search that Daniel's book is about, the search for equality. We're still doing that journey, even though the migration is over, but the journey's not over, right?
There's a tension throughout the history of the book that these communities are facing, which I think faces any kind of middle class community, of sort of where do your allegiances lie and how to sort of navigate this minefield of the cozy up to the elite, make common cause with the masses, and it's as Erin said in an email to me, they kind of made the right choice, but they also had no choice. This community has greatness. These communities have greatness thrust upon them when it becomes clear that they're either all Americans are going to be equal, or they're going to be in this subordinate caste. And it is to their credit that they just never give up. I mean, we think of Reconstruction as ending with the 1876 disputed election, which all of a sudden everyone is reading up on again.
Yep.
But when you look at the activism that the book begins in the even colonial period when this community is forming, and it doesn't end until the early 20th century. I mean, the streetcars of New Orleans and Charleston are not resegregated until the early 20th century. The police departments are not fully resegregated, are not all white again until the early 20th century. And these communities are fighting the whole way. I mean, you think of a case like Plessy versus Ferguson, that test case incident is 1892. The Supreme Court makes this terrible decision 1896. That's 20 years after we think, oh, Reconstruction ended and all of this activism had been defeated. And then you have, the book ends with a kind of tongue-in-cheek, kind of almost like performance art on the streetcars of Charleston, where what is known in local Charleston lingo as a white Negro and a black Negro, meaning two people who are categorized as being colored people, but have different skin tones, two teenage girls board together and then sit right in the middle of the streetcar where it's in that kind of unclear whether it's the white section or the colored section, and wait until the white passengers get so angry that the streetcar driver has to intercede. And then the two girls who have totally different skin colors get up and walk to the very back row and sit down in the colored section as a silent protest of the racial system, and also just a very in-your-face, literally way of pointing out how absurd it is.
Right.
And this is in the 19-teens. This is happening. I got that story from a memoir written by a woman named Mamie Field, and it's with her granddaughter. Her granddaughters are Karen and Barbara Fields. They're the ones who got this book, her story from the early 20th century into publication. I don't think it's a coincidence that the Field sisters are the authors of Racecraft, probably one of the most interesting critical race theory books out there right now about social construction of race. So, in this sense, this community in Charleston, which doesn't have the same, it's not as openly kind of a community as the Creole community in New Orleans. It's a little more kind of underground or less formalized. But even to this day, through the Barbara and Karen Fields, still fighting this same fight that, either America wins or either we win it or America loses. I mean, it's still the most crucial fight in our country.
Right. Well, it is absurd. It's surreal. This whole, it's an absurd kind of situation. And Black people have always known that. And also, I was thinking, what happened? They fought against this reversal of their rights or their way of life. It was almost like what happened. There's a parallel to what happened to the Jews in Nazi Germany. Suddenly they went from being people with rights and right to own property and this and that. Suddenly, you had to go. They became vermin, basically. I mean, it was very dramatic in the case of Nazi Germany, but that's kind of like that was a similar energy here.
And there's a parallel kind of creation, sort of retroactive sorting out of who's Jewish and who's quote unquote German. Right. I mean, the Jews in Germany had been liberated during the Napoleonic Wars in the early 1800s and had been intermarrying with German non-Jews for over a century. Right. But then all of a sudden, oh no, actually you're different races, and then the complicated sorting out process has to take place as a prelude to.
I'm sure a lot of Jews passed as non-Jews, right, to avoid.
Of course.
To avoid persecution. So, and I have just a side note. So, I learned this recently. When Nazi Germany was forming in the 30s, they actually studied the American apartheid system, and one of the people on the committee said, "Oh, that's too extreme. We can't do that here. That is just beyond the pale."
The one drop rule. The one drop rule terrified them because by the 1930s in Germany, who among the German population didn't have one drop?
Exactly.
Very similar to what's going on in colonial Charleston, I think, where, strangely enough, in this kind of ultra racist society, there's no law against interracial marriage in colonial South Carolina. And I think that's because they don't, the ostensibly white elite who are passing these laws don't want to go back and search, who married who in Barbados before we showed up in Charleston in 1658. They didn't want to look at that. They didn't want to know.
No, you don't want to open that door, but it's been open because we have a lot of technology. We have DNA, tests that of course would show everybody is mixed, but it doesn't matter. I mean, the problem now is we've been living with this binary so long that how do you break it down? And I'm actually suspicious of people who say, hey, there's no color. Those because the motive is not right. The motive is, I don't want to deal with color. I don't want to deal with the history of racism. So let's just not look at anything. So I've always been suspicious of that approach, the colorblind kind of stance, which doesn't really, not getting any truth. It's just putting things aside. So it's still quite surreal and I don't know, open as to what, as to how this country will resolve that thing of, we are either all, like Martin Luther King said, you're all slave or all free. That's really the fundamental question. You're all slave or all free. But you just can't be both at the same time.
Yeah, the very last thing I added to the book before the finishing touch was a James Baldwin quote that I came across actually in The Price of the Ticket, which is the name of one of his books, but also a documentary, which I'd really recommend people watch. And the quote is, "It's up to you. As long as you think you're white, there's no hope for you. As long as you think you're white, I'm going to be forced to think I'm black." So I think what James Baldwin is saying there is two things. We do need to see how race was socially constructed and sort of see through race. At the same time, the ball is in the court of white identified Americans to take the first step. You can't as a white identified American, you can't put the onus on African Americans to say, oh, well, that was all a big misunderstanding. Now let's just move on. It's on white Americans to make that first step and retrace kind of all the wrong steps. It's sort of like, when you realize you've gone down a dark road in the woods for 3 miles, you don't just gun it in reverse. You'll kill yourself. You very carefully figure out where each wrong move was and undo it. And I think that's where we need to start as a society.
That makes sense. It's interesting now with people now, of course, intermarriage is, of course, no longer against the law. There's a lot of it. And so what's interesting, I don't know, about 15 or 20 years ago, there was a big push amongst parents of mixed race kids, like black and white, to be some other category, to not be black. They didn't realize that wasn't a good thing to be, but they wanted this other kind of category on the census, which it's kind of an old fight, but I wondered at the time, is it too late to go back to that fight, to that argument that we're all equal and there can be this middle group that's not black or white, but something else. And I realized that didn't even make sense to me. That's not how I've lived. That's not how I live in the world. But I wonder if that's kind of step you're talking about, or are these just clueless white parents who kind of understand that they don't want the kid to be black because that's not really advantageous, and they're trying to create something brand new. I don't know.
I mean, I don't think you want to go down the route, that they go in France, where they just don't collect data based on race or ethnicity or religion, and then they pretend they don't have any problems because they don't have any data backing it up. Whereas, you walk around a neighborhood in Paris and you see that, like, there's obvious racial and religious discrimination. But I think these actual conversations, even if are important. I mean, however we can think about the racial categories on the census. For example, it considers white people, anyone with any of the original people of Europe, the Middle East, or North Africa, which is a kind of absurd categorization. If you talk to say in the era of the Trump Muslim ban, to say that Algerians are white, even by some sort of categorization. But it's not like we're going to eventually get the correct definition of white people. That's an absurd kind of 19th century quasi-eugenicist flirtation with fascism, right? That there's this real thing called a white person, and we just have to figure out quite what it is. So I think you want to be in that kind of uncomfortable space where you're both critical of the categories without denying how much power they have.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
The struggle for universal suffrage and the enforcement of, that is something that you outline brilliantly in your book, Daniel, of course, with Dr. Du Bois as a guide, his seminal study of Black Reconstruction. But if we look today, right now, November 2020, and we throw out the cities Milwaukee, Philadelphia, Atlanta, what is the common link here? And why is there such a struggle now for enfranchisement or disenfranchisement? And it goes back to this moment in American history where Black soldiers, runaway slaves joined together to free this nation, to unify this nation. The first shot on Sumter was fired by a New Orleanian, right? And that Civil War continues to this moment. And anyone, I think, who is interested in the roots of our current dilemma must go to your book to sort out why we're in the dilemma we are in today.
Yes, I appreciate your book, Daniel, because it sorts it out. When people ask me sometimes, well, what are you and where are you from and how did you come about? It's hard to do that in two sentences or less, or three. I mean, it's a very complicated history. But, in regards to how we how to categorize white, basically, because, you can't have white without, as James Baldwin said, you can't, there are no Negroes in the world except in this country. We created the Negro. It does, only exists here. And in terms of suffrage, like Roger was saying, getting back to the beginning of your book, when, those two men went to ask for voting rights, basically, the logic was if you couldn't vote, you were Black. So whoever you were, if you're a person who couldn't vote, you were Black. If you could vote, you're white. So the definitions were political, right? It's like, I think Dick Gregory said, everybody got a chance to be a Negro in this country. Most of them graduated out of it, but some of them didn't. And people like Middle Easterners kind of they fall back into the bottom caste when things get rough, right? The Asian people, same thing. But that categorization, that the Black people, the ones who don't have anything, that's a very, it goes right along with the color. Because this country, it's all about value and property and who gets what. So if you're white, you're entitled to things that the country didn't want everybody entitled to. So that's still particularly the vote. And that is still a very live issue. So, I just hope people see it clearly. What's happening right now, it is so blatant. As a lot of Black folks say, I'm glad it's happening so blatantly and so out in the open. I do hope it wakes people up. I'm not sure it will, but it's very clear to see the dynamic, that has never, kind of went underground sort of, but now it is absolutely not. And once again, we are not ashamed of it, of this division and this. I mean, I'm ashamed of it, but I don't matter. But so hopefully people will see this and it will hit them and they will say, we need to change this.
This is a great profile in courage as well. There were people who put their lives on the line. Denmark Vesey, let's go back to 1822 in Charleston. He was an enslaved African man in Charleston who won the lottery. He hit the lottery. And instead of spending his money frivolously, he purchased his own freedom. And then he set out to get a whole bunch of other people free. And he planned what would have been the biggest slave insurrection in American history in 1822. He was betrayed. He was hanged with 38 of his co-conspirators. He had built what is still the Mother Emanuel church. That church was burned in the wake of the attempted insurrection. It was then rebuilt by his son. The church was then destroyed again by an earthquake. And this, of course, was the church that was invaded by a young man who was welcomed into sanctuary for a Wednesday night prayer meeting, and 9 people were slaughtered right there on John C. Calhoun Street, within view of Fort Sumter, where that first shot of the Civil War was fired, where it started and tragically has never ended.
Wow.
So what you're writing about, Daniel, is not simply a history or an exercise in nostalgia, but rather an essential examination of where we are currently as a nation, and where we have been and how we got here, and possibly how we can get the hell out.
Yeah, it's a story of both what can be done and what can be undone.
Yeah.
When you think of something like the 15th Amendment to the Constitution guaranteeing African-American suffrage, more or less quasi overturned by the Supreme Court in the 1870s, which rules that you can disenfranchise people for any other reason than race, which can of course be used to overlap with race very easily. And we're still, that's what's being litigated right now. That's what's being litigated right now in Milwaukee and Detroit and Philadelphia. So I don't want people to come away from the book feeling hopeless. I want it almost to be the other way. Things move forward. There's progress and there's reaction, and ultimately it's on us. I mean, no one's going to save us but us. Every generation, it's on us to push the ball forward. There are always going to be forces pushing it back down the hill. And I hope that's what people take away from this.
Yeah, I would just say, reading your book, I always think truth and, finding out truth and understanding history is inspiring, and therefore positive. But I really was struck by how heroic these people were, these people of color who fought, and like you say, fought, insisted on making the argument that we deserve what we've been getting. And by the way, everybody else deserves it too. I mean, it's fundamental American heroism, isn't it? Far more than, it's kind of essential heroism. And I also learned, I knew what the Klan was. The Klan actually formed out of this, it was a response to this effort in New Orleans and elsewhere to bring, to act, just during Reconstruction, a time when actually things were going, things were progressing. And there was this halcyon period of cooperation, the integrated school system in New Orleans. Well, the Klan was a reaction to that. They didn't want that line. They didn't want that equality. And I really think today that there are many people who resist that notion of equality. It's not something that they want to achieve. They want to do something. They want to turn it back.
And willing to take violent action to do so.
That's
just
correct.
Like the Klan. Yeah.
And yet over and over, they claim that they say they are reclaiming the American way of life. And in the strict sense, that's true. The American way of life was to keep this very hard line. But that's not, that's not the America that I guess is the ideal, which is more important than the reality. And that's the constant tension that's always been there. Many people are fine with that original reality, that separation. That's in their mind, that's how things are supposed to be. And, we have a long history of things being that way. But at the same time, there's always been resistance to it and chipping away at it. And your book kind of really shows that, getting down to like losing that last 5 pounds, right? You got to get, you got to get very subtle. and but it's very real. And it's, we're still asking that question of inclusion. Don't Black people matter? And it's kind of amazing. We're still asking that very fundamental question, but we are.
I love that formulation as a way to sort of anchor us for that idea of a tension between the ideal and the reality. And I love how this conversation has spanned past and present. Thank you all so much for joining us today. Daniel Brook, Roger Guenveur Smith, Erin Aubry Kaplan, truly a gift to have you all here with us. The book is The Accident of Color, and the paperback comes out on Tuesday, the 24th of November, just in time for Thanksgiving, to reflect about all the paradoxes and tensions and challenges, and maybe a little bit of hope in our nation's history. Thank you all so much for being here. Come see us at SKYLIT Books and pick up your copy this week.
Thank you for listening to the SKYLIT Books podcast series. Please don't forget to visit our website at skylitebooks.com and make sure to follow us on Twitter and Instagram. Also, don't forget to subscribe to this podcast for more author talks and bookseller conversations. You can find us on Podbean, iTunes, and Spotify. Stay safe and healthy, and we hope to see you back in our store soon.
I see